My manager looked me in the eye, smiled the kind of smile people practice in mirrors before performance reviews, and said, "You've done amazing work here, Dana, but we need fresh energy in leadership." Fresh energy. That was the phrase. Not stronger results. Not deeper client trust. Not bigger numbers. Not better judgment. Fresh energy, as if I were a floral arrangement that had been on the conference table too long. I was 53 years old when Colin Mercer said that to me in a glass-walled meeting room on the 31st floor of Halbrecht Consumer Dynamics Chicago headquarters, with a yellow legal pad in front of me and a stainless steel carafe of burnt coffee cooling between us. I remember the exact time because I looked at the digital clock on the wall when he said it, partly because I thought I must have misheard him. 9:14 a.m. At 9:14 a.m., after 14 years at the company, 6 years as Senior Regional Sales Director, and 3 consecutive years of leading the highest-performing enterprise team in the Midwest Division, I realized I was no longer in a meeting about succession planning. I was in a removal process with better lighting. If you had walked past that room, you would have seen 2 well-dressed professionals sitting calmly across from each other. You would have assumed strategy, budgets, maybe a headcount review. You would not have seen the months of small cuts that led to that sentence. You would not have seen the dinners I missed, the Thanksgiving flight I canceled in 2021 because our largest grocery account was threatening to walk, or the 72-hour stretch I spent awake in 2022 during the Ridgeway integration when our forecasting dashboard failed and I rebuilt the presentation deck myself from raw exports because the executive team needed numbers by 7 a.m. You definitely would not have seen the part where I had trained the woman they were quietly grooming to take my role. Her name was Lila Bennett. She was 29, polished, quick, photogenic in a way corporate America mistakes for confidence, and unusually comfortable around senior leadership for someone who had been at the company all of 18 months. She had the kind of confidence that only comes from never having a truly expensive mistake attached to your name. She also had a direct line to Colin that none of the rest of us understood at first. Officially, she was a strategic growth manager. Unofficially, she was Colin's favorite, his showcase project, his proof that he was modernizing the commercial division. She used phrases like legacy thinking and stale relationship management in meetings about accounts I had personally grown from $11.4 million to $38.7 million. She loved saying we should challenge assumptions right before repeating an idea I had floated 2 weeks earlier in smaller words and better lighting. And Colin loved that. To be fair, Colin Mercer was not stupid. That would have made the whole thing simpler. He was 41, Northwestern MBA, former consulting darling, disciplined runner, meticulous haircut, one of those men who could say something insulting in such a measured tone that half the room would mistake it for leadership. He had joined Halbrecht 3 years earlier after a flashy tenure at a consumer analytics firm and arrived with a mandate to reposition for the next generation. The board liked him because he spoke in clean slides. The CEO liked him because he made old cost-cutting ideas sound like innovation. Younger managers liked him because he told them they were the future. People my age were expected to like him because resisting him would make us look exactly as out of touch as he needed us to seem. I tried, at first. That's the humiliating part of betrayal, isn't it? People always imagine rage. They never imagine loyalty hanging on long past dignity. My name is Dana Whitaker. I was 53 when they pushed me out, and before Halbrecht decided I had become too expensive, too seasoned, too inconveniently unshiny, I was one of the people who had helped make that company's expansion possible. In 14 years, I led sales operations across 5 Midwestern states. I closed the Kessler Foods national supply renewal worth $84.2 million over 4 years. I rebuilt the failing Lakeport pharmacy account, increasing annual revenue from $6.8 million to $19.1 million in 22 months. I retained 97.4% of my top-tier client portfolio during the 2020 contraction, when some divisions were bleeding relationships by the week. I trained 11 account executives who were later promoted into leadership roles, 3 of whom still send me Christmas cards and 1 of whom avoided eye contact with me in an elevator during the month I was being erased. I had not done all of that gracefully. That part matters too. I missed my son Eli's college orientation because a pricing dispute with Harrison Bulk Retail hit critical stage 48 hours before signatures. I spent 9 consecutive quarters waking up at 4:45 a.m. for East Coast calls because my territory kept expanding while my support staff kept shrinking. After my divorce in 2018, I poured so much of myself into work that my best friend Nora told me over cold noodles in my kitchen at 10:30 on a Sunday night, "Dana, this company is getting the marriage your husband didn't." She wasn't wrong. My flaw, if we're being honest, was that I believed excellence created protection. I thought if I made myself indispensable enough, measurable enough, undeniable enough, I would be safe from the petty politics that took out people who were merely competent. I thought results would outvote vanity. That belief cost me years. The funny thing about ageism in polished companies is that it rarely arrives wearing a name tag. No one says, "You are too old." They say you are not the face of the next chapter. They say they're thinking about long-term cultural fit. They begin inviting younger employees to innovation dinners and excluding you from informal strategy touchpoints, which is a cute phrase meaning the real meeting happens somewhere you weren't asked to be. They start praising your stability the way people praise a sofa. Useful. Durable. Already purchased. I noticed the shift before I admitted it. First, it was little things. A client summit in Denver where I learned I was no longer delivering the keynote for the commercial team despite having the best retention numbers in the division. Colin gave it to Lila, who had never managed a portfolio larger than $8 million on her own. When I asked why, he said, "I want to give emerging voices a chance." Then it was access. Leadership dinners I had always attended became selective attendance events. My weekly one-on-ones with Colin started getting shortened from 45 minutes to 12. My recommendations began returning to me through younger mouths. My team's headcount request was denied twice for budget discipline, while Lila somehow acquired 2 analysts and a newly created coordinator role under an initiative nobody could fully explain. Then came the workload split, which was almost elegant in its cruelty. I kept the mature accounts, the difficult renewals, the operationally messy clients, the underperforming territories needing rescue. Lila got the visible work, innovation pilots, executive presentations, conference appearances, anything that looked good on LinkedIn or in a board deck. I was carrying the revenue while she carried the spotlight. If corporate sabotage were an Olympic event, that arrangement would have medaled. I told myself there had to be a reason. I told myself Colin was balancing strengths. I told myself I was being paranoid, which is what women my age are trained to call pattern recognition when it makes other people uncomfortable. Then one night, in late February, I stopped lying to myself. It was snowing hard enough that the city outside the office windows looked smudged, all white haze and brake lights. Most of the floor had cleared out by 7 p.m., but I was still in my office working through a margin analysis for a board review Colin had moved up with less than 24 hours notice. I went to print a packet from the shared admin station because my printer had jammed for the 3rd time that week, and when I got there, Lila's deck was already in the tray. I should have left it there. I know that. But my name was on slide 12. Not on the cover. Not in the contributors line. Buried on slide 12 in 6-point font under Legacy Account Transition Risks. I stood there under those punishing fluorescent lights with 27 printed pages in my hand and read a summary of my own client portfolio presented as a problem to be solved. The language was careful, consultant clean. Overdependence on relationship-based management. Limited adaptability to evolving market expectations. Opportunity to align leadership presence with younger buyer demographics. You have to admire the cowardice of corporate phrasing. It allows people to stab you with an adjective and call it strategy. I took the deck back to my office. I read every slide. Lila was pitching a succession-forward commercial realignment in which my accounts would be progressively redistributed over 2 quarters while I transitioned into an advisory capacity. Advisory capacity. The workplace equivalent of being moved to a beautiful farm where everyone insists you'll have more space. There were speaker notes too, because Lila had printed the internal version by mistake. On slide 18, beneath a graph comparing client age clusters, someone had written, Dana respected but increasingly difficult to position as future-facing leader. Colin says timing matters. Colin says timing matters. That was the first moment I understood this wasn't just favoritism. It was a plan. I didn't storm into anyone's office. I didn't cry in the restroom. I didn't confront Lila in the parking garage like a prestige television character with excellent cheekbones and no mortgage. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started documenting everything. That instinct probably saved me. I created a private timeline on my home computer, not my work machine. Dates, meeting notes, calendar screenshots, revised org charts, staffing approvals, speaking engagement swaps, compensation memos, Slack exports, and the increasingly strange language showing up in internal communications around leadership image, energy alignment, and market resonance. I kept copies of praise when it came, because hypocrisy ages badly under fluorescent scrutiny. I saved quarterly scorecards proving my team outperformed every comparable unit Colin held up as the future. I exported emails where he promised I was the clear frontrunner for Vice President of Regional Commercial Strategy once restructuring finalized. That promise, by the way, had been made on May 16th at 6:42 p.m. I remember because I was in a hotel lobby in Minneapolis eating almonds out of a cocktail napkin instead of having dinner. He had called me personally, warm as bourbon. "Dana, stay patient," he said. "I know you've been carrying a lot. I see it. When the dust settles, this is going to put you exactly where you belong." Where I belonged, apparently, was in a file. For a while, I still believed I could outwork the machine turning against me. That is another humiliating truth. I didn't become strategic because I was fearless. I became strategic because I was wounded slowly enough to keep hoping. In April, I delivered the biggest quarter of my career. My team closed $31.6 million in net new enterprise revenue and renewed 94% of at-risk contracts in a territory that corporate had internally labeled mature and vulnerable. Colin congratulated me in the leadership meeting, then spent 15 minutes praising Lila's vision on a pilot program that had not yet made a dollar. 2 weeks later, he left me off a board prep session involving 3 of my own accounts. In May, Lila started sitting in on calls with my clients for exposure. In June, one of those clients called me afterward and said, carefully, "Dana, are you leaving?" Because the questions she asked sounded like transition questions. I lied to him. "No," I said, standing in my kitchen with my work bag still on my shoulder. "Nothing's changing." But by then, I had enough evidence to know something was. And I had started noticing another detail. It was subtle until it wasn't. The people being edged sideways, reclassified, reimagined, or offered gentle off-ramps were all over 48. Not all women. Not all from one unit. But old enough to remember how the company ran before people started calling basic competence legacy energy. A procurement lead in his late 50s disappeared after 30 years and re-emerged as a special consultant with no staff. A finance director, 51, was told her role was being modernized, then replaced by 2 younger hires with titles so inflated they sounded AI-generated. A market research VP, 60, was suddenly praised for her years of wisdom 3 weeks before being offered a retirement package she had not requested. It was never said plainly. That was the brilliance of it. Plausible deniability is the native language of cowards with HR support. The day it finally broke open for me was July 9th. Tuesday. Humid enough that the river smelled metallic. Colin's assistant sent me a calendar invite titled Org Alignment Conversation. 30 minutes. Conference room B, HR included. If you've been in corporate life long enough, you know there are meeting titles that function like padded envelopes. They soften nothing. They just prevent witnesses from seeing the shape of the weapon inside. I walked in with my notebook, my reading glasses, and the kind of composure a woman develops after decades of realizing that if she shows emotion too early, men will use it as evidence against her. Colin was already there. So was Marisol Kent from HR, elegant, unreadable, hands folded over a leather portfolio. Colin gestured for me to sit, and then he delivered the script companies use when they want your labor history, but not your body in the chair anymore. Restructuring. Efficiency. Strategic realignment. Evolving market needs. Then the sentence about fresh energy. I let him finish. That surprised him. He explained that my position was being eliminated, though of course some responsibilities would continue under a revised leadership model. He told me they were prepared to offer a retirement transition package even though I had never mentioned retirement, had not planned retirement, and was, for the record, 13 years away from the age at which I had intended to even discuss the words seriously. He said this could be a graceful next chapter. Graceful. That word too. I asked one question. Who is assuming my accounts? Colin folded his hands. They'll be distributed across a few leaders. Which leaders? A pause. Tiny. Telling. Lila will take point on several strategic relationships. Of course she would. I wish I could tell you that was the moment I unleashed some perfect line, something crisp and cinematic that would make strangers clap in the comments. The truth is better, I think, because it was quieter and far more dangerous. I nodded. Then I said, I'll need the restructuring criteria, the updated org chart, the selection methodology, and documentation of all role eliminations affecting directors and above in the last 18 months. Marisol blinked first. Colin gave me the smile people use when they think you're still operating inside the system they control. We can provide what's appropriate. Good, I said. Please also include the performance benchmarks used to determine redundancy. Since my team has led the region for 3 years, I'd like to understand the model. The room changed temperature. That was the first moment they realized I was not going to help them tell this story cleanly. If you've ever been underestimated by someone younger, more polished, and absolutely convinced that experience is just inertia with wrinkles, you already know the look I saw on Colin's face. Mild annoyance, faint amusement, total miscalculation. He thought I was asking because I was hurt. I was asking because I was building a file. And if what happened next made national headlines, if journalists started calling the company's media office for comment, if former employees began posting their own stories, if fresh energy became the kind of phrase that follows executives around like toilet paper on a shoe, it all started there, with me sitting in that room, listening very carefully, deciding that if they wanted to turn my career into a quiet disposal, I was going to make the noise impossible to contain. If you've ever been told your experience makes you less valuable the moment it becomes inconvenient to someone ambitious, keep listening, because what I found after that meeting was worse than favoritism, worse than betrayal, and a lot more expensive for them than simply giving me the promotion they promised. I walked out of that meeting with my notebook closed and my face arranged into the neutral expression women in corporate life learn sometime between their first interrupted presentation and their first stolen idea. I did not slam a door. I did not call anyone from the elevator and speak in the clipped, shaking voice of the newly betrayed. I nodded at 2 people from legal in the hallway, stepped into the restroom, checked that my lipstick had not migrated, and then stood at the sink long enough to feel the cold marble under both palms. That was the first layer. The second arrived before noon. By 11:37 a.m., my access to the executive forecasting workspace had been downgraded. Not removed. Downgraded. Again, there is a special kind of cowardice in partial access. It lets people claim continuity while quietly severing your ability to see the room where your own future is being discussed. My shared drive permissions narrowed. My invite to the August leadership offsite disappeared. A recurring strategy call I had attended every Thursday for 2 years suddenly showed no longer available on my calendar, as if the meeting itself had dissolved into weather. I took screenshots of everything. Then I emailed Marisol and Colin requesting the documentation I had asked for in the room, copied it to my personal legal folder at home using dates and summaries only, no protected files, no trade secrets, nothing stupid. I was angry, not reckless. People always imagine revenge as emotion without discipline. The useful version is the opposite. At 1:10 p.m., Nora called. Nora Feldman had been my closest friend since 2009, when she was brought in as a compliance manager and offended half the building by using complete sentences instead of euphemisms. She was 56, wore flat shoes with excellent suits, and had a way of looking at policy manuals like they were witness statements. If Colin was designed in a lab to reassure board members, Nora looked like the person you accidentally confessed to. You sound calm, she said after I told her. I'm furious in a tax-efficient way. That's usually when you're the most dangerous. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass wall of my office at the bullpen I had helped build. 3 account managers were arguing softly over a renewal schedule. Someone laughed near the espresso machine. A printer somewhere coughed out another doomed deck. The whole place had the indecency to look normal. They offered me retirement, I said. Nora went quiet for half a second. Voluntary. With a script. And your role? Eliminated, except apparently not eliminated enough to stop existing under younger lighting. Jesus. That's one interpretation. Nora lowered her voice. Dana, listen carefully. Don't assume this is just about Lila. I sat up. Why would you say that? Another pause. Not theatrical. Cautious. Because I've seen language like this in 2 other files this quarter. There it was. The kind of sentence that changes the temperature in your spine. What files? I'm not emailing anything. I'm not forwarding anything. I'm saying, as your friend and not in any official capacity, that if I were you, I would make a list of everyone over 45 who's been restructured out since January of last year. Then I would compare titles, severance packages, and who inherited the work. That was the moment the story shifted for me. Until then, I thought I was looking at favoritism with an ageist garnish. A vain man rewarding the younger woman who made him feel current. Ugly, yes. Common, absolutely. But still personal. Still small enough to fit inside office politics. Nora was telling me it might be systemic. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because they're getting sloppier, she said. And because you're not crazy. That phrase nearly broke me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was precise. One of the ugliest side effects of professional marginalization is how efficiently it colonizes your own mind. By the time the facts are undeniable, you've already spent months rehearsing the possibility that you're oversensitive, vain, threatened, resistant, aging badly, imagining patterns, punishing young women for being ambitious, punishing young men for being polished. You do half the institution's work for it by doubting your own eyesight. Nora knew that. So I went home that night, opened my laptop at my dining room table, and built the list. I started with public exits, LinkedIn updates, press releases, internal announcements preserved in old emails. Then I added the quieter cases, the people who had been moved into advisory roles, transitional consulting arrangements, strategic project positions with no team and no authority. I tracked 16 departures or demotions over 18 months at director level and above. 12 of those people were over 48. 9 were over 50. 8 had performance ratings in the top 2 bands. 7 were replaced directly. In 6 of those 7, the replacement was at least 12 years younger. The youngest gap was 12 years. The largest was 27. That was not a trend. That was a fingerprint. I did not sleep much that week. Not out of despair. Out of clarity. Every time I thought I had seen the whole shape of it, another angle emerged. Colin was still central, but not singular. I later learned the operating committee had been circulating internal language around future-facing leadership optics for at least 9 months. The phrase sounds like it should come with a ring light and a personality disorder, but in practice it translated into very concrete decisions. Who got stage time? Who got development money? Whose compensation was framed as an investment versus an efficiency issue? Who was labeled growth and who was labeled legacy? Legacy. Another one of those words. Do you know how often companies use words that sound respectful while preparing to erase you? It's almost beautiful. Like being strangled with a silk tie. The next surprise came from an unlikely source. Raj Beatty asked me to meet him outside the building on Thursday morning before work. Raj was 47, director of market analytics, permanently sleep-deprived, and one of those men who seemed allergic to office theater. He wore the same navy quarter zips year-round and spoke in the clipped rhythm of someone who trusted spreadsheets more than humans. I respected him because he rarely had an agenda visible from space. We got coffee from a cardon whacker because Raj distrusted cafes with branding. He held his cup with both hands and stared at the river for a moment before speaking. I heard about your meeting, he said. Corporate grief travels fast. This isn't grief. It's pattern recognition. I looked at him. Nora used the same phrase. She's smarter than most of legal. That's a low bar. Raj almost smiled. I shouldn't be talking to you. Then don't. I'm tired and overdressed and recently informed that my energy is no longer fresh. That did make him smile. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded page. Read that later, he said. It was a printout of a slide from an operating review. No confidential numbers I could use publicly, just an internal segmentation chart with 3 leadership tags: build, accelerate, sunset. Beside a list of role categories was a note in comments mode: prioritize visible succession under 40 where possible. Under 40. Not even dressed up. Just there. Casual as poison in a water glass. I looked up. Where did this come from? Raj shook his head. I'm not a source. I'm a man with a mortgage and 2 daughters in private school. Why help me? Because they tried to rope me into modeling attrition justifications by age bracket and then acted offended when I asked if they wanted discrimination in pivot table form. That surprised me enough that I laughed. Actually laughed. They're on the sidewalk, with buses exhaling at the curb and the wind trying to lift my hair into litigation. Raj went on, quieter now. I don't think Colin invented this. I think he operationalized it. That distinction mattered. It meant I wasn't dealing with one ambitious executive making ugly choices in a vacuum. I was looking at a culture strategy, one polished enough to survive internal review because everyone involved could pretend they were discussing modernization instead of age. When I got back to my apartment that night, I added Raja's page to the file, scanned my notes, and started organizing everything by category: language, personnel changes, performance contradictions, succession grooming, access restrictions, and retaliatory timing. If my leverage was documentation, I was going to make it impossible to dismiss as bitterness. Bitterness is easy to condescend to. Evidence is harder. And then, because the universe likes symmetry, Lila called me. Friday, 8:18 p.m. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity has ruined better women than me. Dana, she said, voice bright and tentative. Hi, is this a bad time? Depends. Are you selling knives or absolution? A small laugh. Nervous. Okay, you're still funny. I've had to diversify. She exhaled. I heard the conversation didn't go well. Interesting. Since I wasn't aware it had become open mic night. I didn't mean. No, I know. You meant concern wrapped around reconnaissance. Go ahead. There was a long enough silence that I could hear traffic through her speaker. When she came back, her tone had changed. Less polished. Younger. I just wanted to say I really respect everything you've built here. That sentence, from anyone else, might have landed differently. From the woman inheriting my clients, it sounded like a floral arrangement at a funeral. Do you? I asked. Yes. Then tell me when you first knew. Another silence. This one sharper. Knew what? Don't insult me, Lila. You're ambitious, not stupid. She inhaled. I knew there was a restructure being discussed. When? A few weeks ago. I said nothing. Finally, she added, maybe longer. There it was. A crack. How much longer? Dana. No. You called me. I heard her move. Maybe sit down. Colin asked me in April to start shadowing some of your accounts more formally. He said there might be opportunities to preserve continuity if leadership changed. April. The same month he was congratulating me in meetings and telling me my promotion path was still alive. That was the mid-story twist, though I did not label it that way at the time. I just felt something cold and clean settle into place. Until then, part of me had still believed the decision to remove me might have been made late. Opportunistic, yes, but recent. A bad quarter somewhere else. Board pressure. Budget panic with my salary attached to it. No. They had started transferring my future while promising me I still had one. I asked, very calmly, did you say yes immediately? That's not fair. Neither is stealing someone's life in stages. Did you? I said I wanted to grow. Such a perfect answer. So bloodless. So contemporary. Nobody ever says, I agreed to benefit from your humiliation. They say, I said yes to growth. You know what the irony is? I asked. I actually did want you to grow. I never asked for this to happen like this. And yet here we are. Her voice tightened. You think I had more power than I did? No, I said. I think you had enough power to ask better questions. That ended the conversation. Not dramatically. She murmured something about hoping we could speak again. I said, I hope one day you learn the cost of being flattered by the wrong man, and hung up. Then I sat in my dark kitchen with my phone face down beside me and let myself feel the full, stupid ache of it. Because here is my genuine weakness, the one I cannot dress in strategy. I had liked her once. I had seen something of my younger self in her drive, minus the ring light. I had defended her to people who thought she was all polish and no ballast. I had corrected her decks, coached her before presentations, told her which clients needed silence instead of cleverness. There is a special humiliation in realizing your mentorship was harvested like a crop. The next Monday, the company made its move public. At 9:03 a.m., an internal memo announced a commercial modernization initiative affecting 23 roles company-wide. My role was listed under transitioning leadership positions, which sounds like a spa treatment for professional death. The note praised my years of commitment and said I would be supporting a smooth handoff over the next 30 days. I had not agreed to a handoff. I had not agreed to anything except receiving insult in a chair. Within an hour, I had 11 texts, 3 former employees emailing me from personal accounts, and 1 voicemail from my ex-husband, Ted, who had an almost supernatural ability to sense professional catastrophe and arrive with the emotional grace of a folding chair. Hey, he said when I finally called him back that night. Eli told me what happened. You okay? No, Ted. I'm thriving. They've put me out to pasture with excellent branding. He ignored that. To his credit, age had made him less defensive and more useful. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Dana, don't burn yourself down trying to win an argument with people who already chose their version. That irritated me because it was partly wise. You always do this, I said. You make restraint sound noble after someone else has thrown the punch. No, he said, and his voice surprised me. Softer than I expected. I'm saying you don't have to prove you were hurt. Anyone decent can see it. That bizarrely almost undid me more than the meeting had. Not because Ted was my moral compass. He absolutely was not. But because he had known me long enough to hear the strain underneath the sarcasm. After I hung up, I went into my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and had the least cinematic breakdown imaginable. No collapsing. No sobbing into decorative pillows. I just put my face in my hands and cried the way competent women cry when there's laundry in the dryer and emails still unanswered. Quietly. Efficiently. As if even grief should avoid taking up too much space. I let myself have 23 minutes. Then I washed my face, opened my laptop, and kept going. By then, the file had grown from a folder into a map. Former employees started talking. Not publicly yet. Privately. One told me she had been asked whether she had the stamina for the next chapter 2 weeks before being replaced by a 32-year-old promoted over her. Another, a man named Curtis from procurement, said HR had floated retirement to him at 59 despite his division posting record savings of $14.6 million that fiscal year. He told me, they kept saying I should enjoy my life more, which is generous advice from people who were taking my salary and my authority at the same time. I also heard from Denise Alvarado, former VP of Market Research, the same woman I had watched get draped in praise right before being sidelined. We met in a hotel bar off Michigan Avenue because she said she was too paranoid for coffee and too old for juice bars. Denise was 60, immaculate, and radiated the serene menace of someone who had stopped needing approval 2 decades earlier. She listened while I laid out what I had. She asked precise questions. Dates. Names. Who had said what first? Which phrases repeated? When I finished, she swirled the ice in her glass once and said, "You're still thinking too small. I have 16 cases. You have 1 company-wide strategy and 16 visible symptoms." I almost smiled. That's a cheerful framing. It's an accurate one. Then she gave me the most surprising conversation of that entire month. "I don't think Colin hates older workers," she said. I frowned. That's generous. No. It's worse. She leaned forward. I think he genuinely believes he's improving the company. Men like him don't see themselves as cruel. They see themselves as necessary. They replace human beings with aesthetics and call it adaptation. That stayed with me because it explained his composure. Colin was not sloppy enough to rant about age or mock people behind closed doors. He didn't need to. He had converted prejudice into strategy language and therefore into virtue. In his mind, he was not discriminating. He was curating the future, which made him harder to fight and easier to expose. By the second week of August, I had 214 pages of emails, timelines, comparative personnel data, annotated memos, screenshots, severance language, and witness summaries. I also had something even more valuable: repetition. Journalists can ignore one bitter executive. They get interested when they see a pattern with dates attached. I hadn't yet decided exactly how far I would go. Let me be honest about that. For all my composure, I still had moments where I stared at the file and wondered whether I was about to turn myself into a cautionary tale people would whisper about in networking calls. Difficult. Vindictive. Couldn't let go. There is always a tax for women who refuse graceful erasure. And still, every day brought another detail too ugly to leave alone. A junior HR partner accidentally sent me a scheduling note intended for Marisol that referenced retirement track messaging consistency. I saved it. One of my clients, Kessler Foods, requested clarification after Lila misrepresented a pricing history I had negotiated over 3 years and 8 months. I saved that too. Then came the thing that made the whole structure wobble. Raj called me again, this time after 10 p.m., which meant it was serious because he considered evening phone calls a symptom of civilizational decline. They're doing damage control, he said without preamble. For what? For you. I leaned against my kitchen counter. I haven't done anything. You asked for documents in the room. You started talking to people. That was enough. What are they saying? He hesitated. That you've been struggling with transition. That they were concerned about burnout. That the retirement package was partly a kindness. I closed my eyes. That was the oldest trick in the book. First remove the woman, then narrate her decline for her. Who's repeating it? I asked. Colin in small rooms. Marisol in safer language. Lila, I don't know. Of course. If the hard evidence ever surfaced, they needed a softer story pre-installed. Not discrimination, concern. Not exclusion, support. Not replacement, compassion. I laughed then once, with no humor in it. How philanthropic of them. Dana, Raj said, if you're going to move, move cleanly. No half measures. That was the closest thing to advice I ever got from him. So if you're still with me here, if you've ever sat in a room and realized the story being written about you no longer has your consent, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe, because what happened next is where they stopped controlling the narrative. Up to that point, they thought they were managing an exit. What they were actually doing was building me a paper trail so thorough that by the time I sent one anonymous package to the right reporter, I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to let them read what they had written about people like me when they thought no one outside the building would ever see it. And once I made that decision, everything sharpened. My fear didn't disappear. It just became less important than the file. The first reporter I contacted never answered me. That's worth saying because people love to imagine these stories unfolding with cinematic obedience. I did not send one beautifully assembled packet and watch justice descend from the heavens in a tailored blazer. I sent a careful, anonymous email from a new encrypted account at 6:12 a.m. on a Wednesday to a business journalist at a national outlet who had recently covered executive turnover in consumer goods. I attached a short memo, 3 redacted documents, a timeline summary, and one question phrased so precisely it almost sounded polite. Have you looked at leadership turnover by age at Halbrecht Consumer Dynamics over the last 18 months? Nothing. By 5 p.m., still nothing. By the next morning, also nothing. For about 14 hours, I felt ridiculous. Not morally righteous. Ridiculous. Like a woman in her 50s hunched over a laptop in reading glasses, trying to convince the universe that corporate language could still scandalize anyone in an economy built on euphemism. I went to the grocery store that afternoon and found myself standing in front of citrus for an embarrassingly long time because I could not remember whether I needed lemons or limes. That is what stress does. It doesn't always make you dramatic. Sometimes it just makes produce impossible. Then at 7:43 p.m. on Thursday, my encrypted inbox pinged. The reply was 4 lines long. Interested. Need corroboration and broader pattern. Can you prove replacement ages, internal language, and whether anyone raised concerns internally? No signature beyond a first name, Elise. I sat back in my kitchen chair and reread those lines 6 times. Not because I didn't understand them, because I did. The door had opened exactly 3 inches, and now I had to decide whether I was willing to put my hand in it and risk losing the whole arm. I wrote back in 11 minutes. Brief, controlled, useful. I confirmed I had documentation of internal language, transition timelines, role transfers, and witness accounts from multiple former employees. I did not oversell. I did not editorialize. If you want journalists to trust you, sound less like an activist and more like a person who knows where the bodies are filed. Elise and I spent the next 19 days building the story. Not together, exactly. That would sound intimate, and nothing about the process felt intimate. It felt surgical. She asked for evidence in tranches. I provided metadata, redactions, contextual explanations, dates, screenshots, copies of internal org charts, public records, LinkedIn transition histories, severance phrasing, and names of people who might talk off the record if approached carefully. She wanted patterns, not pain. That distinction made me trust her. There is a kind of dignity in being useful after someone has tried to reclassify you as obsolete. I still had 30 days on paper before my transition ended, though by then the company was treating me like a decorative lamp no one remembered ordering. My access narrowed further. My calendar thinned. Lila began appearing on client calls with the overbright confidence of someone trying to wear a blazer that technically fit but still wasn't hers. Colin kept his distance, which in his case was not retreat. It was staging. He was waiting for me to either sign quietly or make an emotional mistake he could package as instability. Instead, I smiled in meetings, answered what I chose to answer, and watched. There is a unique pleasure in becoming unreadable to people who built their strategy around your predictability. The first real tremor hit when Elise asked whether anyone still inside the company would speak to her on background. I told her maybe, which was true in the way weather forecasts are true, directionally useful, emotionally unreliable. I gave her 3 names with caveats, and one of them was not Nora. I refused to risk Nora. That mattered later. The one I did not expect to speak was Lila. I didn't learn that until much later, but the signs started appearing before I knew why. She became uneven around me. Not guilty in the theatrical sense. More fragmented. She missed details she normally caught. On one client transition call, she referred to a pricing concession that had been rejected in 2023, and I corrected her so smoothly the client probably didn't notice, but she looked at me afterward with a strange, almost pleading expression. Not apology. Something less useful. The dawning realization that proximity to power does not protect you from what power is. That Friday, she asked if we could talk in person. I almost said no. Then curiosity, once again, dragged me by the sleeve. We met in a conference room no one used because one of the shades had broken months earlier and left the west wall perpetually half-blinded. The room smelled faintly of dry erase marker and stale carpet. Lila stood when I came in, then sat immediately, as if unsure which etiquette still applied to the woman she was replacing. "I know you don't owe me this," she said. That's an encouraging start. She flinched, but she kept going. "I need to tell you something before this gets worse." I closed the door and sat across from her. "Then don't rehearse it. Just say it." She folded her hands so tightly the knuckles blanched. "Colin's been telling people this was mutual. That you were exhausted. That you'd been talking about stepping back for months. I'm aware." Her eyes lifted. "You knew." "Lila, please. You all narrate women the same way once you decide to move them." She inhaled sharply, then pushed on. "That's not the only thing." There it was. The floor opening. She told me that 2 weeks before my so-called org alignment meeting, Colin had shown her a draft transition chart with my accounts already divided. She told me he had asked her to start relationship warming with 3 of my largest clients in April, specifically Kessler Foods, North Point Home, and the Ridgeway portfolio. Combined annual value, $61.3 million. He told her the board wanted visible generational movement ahead of the Autumn Investor Roadshow. He also told her, and this detail landed like broken glass, that older directors tended to resist digital transformation because their confidence is usually tied to legacy relationships. I looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" She swallowed. "Because I thought I was being mentored into something. I'm starting to think I was being used to sanitize something." I almost admired the sentence. Starting to think. As if this were an intellectual mist slowly lifting and not a moral collapse that had been visible from space. "You were used," I said. "You also cooperated." "I know. Do you?" Yes. I believed she felt bad. I did not yet know whether feeling bad would make her brave. Then she said the surprising part. "I talked to a reporter." The room went very still. "What?" She nodded once, brittle and pale. She reached out. She said she was looking into leadership transitions. "I didn't name you directly at first." But then she asked about the succession chart and the investor roadshow language, and she stopped, shook her head. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." I should tell you I felt triumph. I did, for one clean second. A witness from inside. A direct line. A crack in the protective shell. Then I felt the more complicated thing, revulsion at how long it had taken, and pity for how obviously she had just realized her own replaceability. "Did you give her documents?" I asked. "No, just context. Dates. The roadshow framing. The phrase, visible generational movement. That was enough. More than enough, if corroborated." I stood, walked to the broken shade, looked out at the river. "You understand," I said without turning, "that if this goes public, Colin will not carry this alone." "I know. He'll say you misinterpreted him. He'll say you were enthusiastic. He'll say he was developing talent and you overeat a strategy conversation." "I know. And if legal starts sniffing around, you may discover how quickly favorites become liabilities." Her voice, when it came, was very small. "I know. That was the first time I saw her age. Not numerically. Structurally. The youth that had looked like confidence was, in that moment, just inexperience colliding with a machine she had mistaken for a ladder." I turned back. "Why no?" She looked at me with eyes that had finally stopped trying to win. "Because I watched him say I was the future to my face, and then I found out he's interviewing a 31-year-old from Austin for a newly expanded VP role he told me didn't exist yet." There it was. The oldest corporate lesson in the world. Betrayal becomes legible to some people only when it reaches their own desk. I wish I could tell you I forgave her. I did not. But I nodded once. "If anyone asks," I said, "we had a transition discussion." That's it. That's all you get from me today. She started crying after I opened the door. Not loud. Just the sharp, involuntary kind, as if her body had finally stopped participating in her resume. I kept walking. That weekend, Elise confirmed what I had suspected. She had enough to publish if one more former senior employee would speak on the record or if a second internal source validated the language around generational transition. Denise provided the on-the-record quote. Of course she did. Denise had the bearing of a woman who would testify at her own surprise party if it improved the record. Her quote, when it ran, was surgical. The company wrapped age-coded leadership decisions in modernization language, but the pattern was clear to anyone willing to count. Anyone willing to count. God, I loved her for that. I was still technically employed when the article went live. Monday, 8:02 a.m. I know the time because I was in my car in the garage under my building, one hand on the steering wheel, the other around a travel mug of coffee I never drink. My phone lit up with 3 texts at once, then 4 more, then an email preview from Elise with the subject line "It's up." The headline was not subtle. Good. It laid out 18 months of leadership transitions at Halbrecht, highlighted the disproportionate removal of employees over 48 from director-level roles, quoted former executives, referenced internal terminology about future-facing leadership optics, and detailed how one high-performing sales director was steered into premature retirement while her accounts were reassigned during a so-called modernization push. They did not name me in the first paragraph. They named me in the third. I sat there in the dim concrete light of that garage, engine off, reading my own life rendered into public fact. My pulse felt strangely distant, as if it belonged to a younger woman in a worse car. I expected panic. Instead, I felt the click of alignment. The power had shifted not because I suddenly became invulnerable, but because the story no longer depended on my private credibility. It was documented, cross-checked, readable by anyone with a browser and unresolved contempt for corporate hypocrisy. By 8:27 a.m., the article had been picked up by 2 industry newsletters. By 9:11 a.m., a legal contact I knew from a vendor side channel texted me, "Your board is in emergency session." By 10:03 a.m., Halbrecht stock was down 6.4%. By 11:40 a.m., 3 former employees I had never even met had posted their own transition stories publicly, including dates, ages, and eerily similar language from HR. That was the moment I felt it. Not victory. Not yet. Velocity. The thing had escaped the room. My phone rang at 12:16 p.m. Colin. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Dana. He was using his measured voice, the one designed to suggest both authority and sorrow. I assume you've seen the article. Hard to miss. I'm calling because this has become very serious. I looked at the steering wheel and actually smiled. Just now. A pause. Tiny. The man hated unscripted silence. This kind of media distortion helps no one, he said. If you have concerns, there were internal avenues. I laughed. Not nicely. Colin, you offered me involuntary retirement while transferring $61.3 million in accounts and narrating me as burnt out in small rooms. Do not talk to me about internal avenues like you discovered ethics in a hallway. His tone hardened a degree. You're making assumptions based on incomplete information. No. I'm making conclusions based on your own language. Another pause. Then the first crack in his composure. Was it you? There is a pleasure so rare it almost qualifies as medicine. This was one of those moments. I said, if your strategy was sound, why are you asking? He exhaled through his nose. If you've been sharing internal documentation, you should be more concerned about why so many people recognized themselves in the article. He changed tactics. Dana, whatever happened between us, I respected your contribution. There it is, I said softly. Contribution. Past tense before the body is even cold. Please don't do this. That surprised me. Not the words. The phrasing. Not don't escalate this. Not let's talk. Please don't do this. For 1 second, I heard the man under the presentation training, not remorseful, just caught between risk and image. You did this, I said. I'm just watching you explain it. Then I hung up. At 1:05 p.m., the company issued a statement so aggressively sterile it could have been used in surgery. Halbrecht denied discriminatory intent, affirmed its commitment to an inclusive workplace, and announced an independent review led by outside counsel. Whenever a company says independent review before lunch, understand that several people are already searching old email chains with shaking hands. I did not return to the office that day. Nobody asked me to. Nobody needed to. The story had made physical presence irrelevant. Instead, I sat at my dining table in a t-shirt I had owned since 2017 and watched the whole machine jerk sideways in real time. Former clients reached out. 2 said they were reevaluating partnership confidence. A board member I had met only twice sent a terse note through an intermediary asking if I would make myself available for confidential questions. Reporters from 3 other outlets emailed by evening. 1 television producer wanted me on camera. I declined that one immediately. Trauma is not improved by studio makeup. The consequences kept multiplying. By Wednesday, Halbrecht had retained a crisis PR firm. By Thursday, the company's market value had dropped approximately $214 million from Monday's open. Not all because of my story, obviously. Markets are moody teenagers with Bloomberg terminals. But the timing was not subtle, and neither were investor questions. The autumn roadshow was postponed. A pension fund in Minnesota requested clarification on succession governance. An employment attorney wrote an op-ed calling the case a textbook example of demographic sanitization through restructuring language, which is not a phrase I would recommend for a first date, but worked beautifully in print. Then the second article landed. Elise published follow-up reporting with 2 additional internal sources, one of whom was clearly Lila without being named, and 1 leaked slide image containing the phrase prioritize visible succession under 40 where possible. That phrase detonated. You could almost hear compliance departments across the industry inhaling. I later found out the board meeting that followed lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. I was told one director asked whether anyone in senior leadership had undergone training specifically on age discrimination in workforce planning. I was told the silence after that question was long enough to become a character. 3 days later, Marisol was placed on leave pending review. A week after that, Colin announced he was stepping aside during the investigation. Stepping aside. Yet another euphemism. Corporate language is a haunted house where every room contains a passive construction. I did not celebrate. That may sound counterintuitive after everything I've told you, but celebration requires emotional simplicity, and I did not have any left. What I had was adrenaline, exhaustion, and a dawning understanding that public exposure is not closure. It is weather. Once it starts, it blows through every room you thought was sealed. My name was now searchable. My son Eli called and asked, carefully, whether I was okay with friends sending him the article. My ex-husband started forwarding me think pieces, which I experienced as an act of violence. Nora was interviewed by outside counsel and spent 2 nights texting me phrases like, "They are absolutely panicking," and "Someone in legal just used the phrase optics issue," and I nearly bit through a pen. Raj disappeared for 48 hours, then resurfaced long enough to say, I was not elegant, but I was accurate, which for him qualified as emotional disclosure. And Lila? Lila requested a transfer, then rescinded it, then was placed under review after metadata tied her to early transition materials contradicting public company timelines. I later learned she hired her own lawyer. We did not speak again for almost 6 months. The strangest call I received came from Denise. It was 9:30 at night. I was sitting on my couch eating crackers because full meals had become theoretical. "You sound terrible," she said. "Thank you. It's the scandal. I'm serious. Have you gone outside today?" I opened a window. "That's not outside, Dana. That's just negotiated oxygen." I laughed despite myself. Then Denise said something I did not expect. "You know they're going to offer you money." I sat up. "How much?" "Enough to test your ethics and insult your losses at the same time." She was right. 10 days later, Halbrecht's outside counsel reached out through my attorney. I should mention that by then I had one. The package they floated included enhanced severance, non-disclosure expansion, neutral reference terms, accelerated equity vesting, and a compensation figure of $842,000 before taxes. That is a lot of money. It is also, depending on what was taken from you, not remotely enough. I considered it anyway. Of course I did. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either independently wealthy or lying for spiritual branding. I was 53. Suddenly unemployed, publicly associated with a national ageism story, and deeply aware that principles do not cover health insurance. For 48 hours, I paced my apartment like a woman auditioning to be a cautionary tale in low heels. Then I turned it down. Not because I was noble. Because the non-disclosure terms were too broad, the internal reform commitments were performative mush, and the number itself told me something useful. If they were willing to put $842,000 on the table before findings were final, then the risk inside those findings was larger. I wanted the findings. And I got them, at least the parts the public was allowed to see. 11 weeks after Elise's first article, the outside review concluded that Halbrecht had not maintained adequate controls against age-based bias in leadership transition planning, had used inconsistent criteria in director-level restructuring decisions, and had failed to document legitimate business justification in multiple cases involving employees over 45. They did not use the phrase systemic discrimination in the public summary because lawyers charge by the syllable and fear plain English, but the substance was obvious. The company announced 5 reforms within 72 hours: mandatory external review for all executive restructuring decisions for 24 months, age bias auditing and succession planning, reinstatement eligibility for selected former employees, board-level oversight of workforce transition metrics, and a revised whistleblower protocol routed outside internal HR. They also created an ombuds office staffed by 2 external employment specialists, which sounded very noble and also very expensive. That was the formal consequence. The informal ones were more interesting. 2 clients moved business worth a combined $18.9 million within the next quarter, citing leadership stability concerns. The investor roadshow was cut from 6 cities to 3. A board compensation committee member quietly retired. Colin did not return. Officially, he resigned to pursue other opportunities. I later heard through 3 separate channels that no equivalent public company role materialized for him for at least a year. His reputation did not explode. It curdled, which in our world is often worse. There are plenty of executives who survive scandal if they remain useful. What they don't survive as easily is becoming associated with a pattern boards have to explain. Marisol eventually negotiated her own exit. I'm told she was furious that Colin's camp tried to frame HR as the sole failure point. She was wrong in some ways, complicit in others, and absolutely not the architect. Institutions love sacrificing the department most visibly tasked with decency. It let strategy pretend it was merely procedural. And me? For 3 months after the public review, I could not answer the question, "What are you doing now?" without wanting to throw something. Because the truthful answer was, recovering badly. I had sleep that came in fragments. I jumped when unknown numbers called. I hated grocery stores for reasons I could not articulate. I was invited to speak on panels about workplace equity and said no to 7 of them because I could not bear the idea of becoming professionally fluent in my own mistreatment. I spent one entire Tuesday reorganizing my spice drawer because cumin was easier than identity. That is the cost side of public exposure no one really markets. You do not emerge as a triumphant statue. You emerge as a person whose private injury became legible at scale, and scale is not tender. The unexpected detail is this: what finally pulled me back into myself was not a glamorous new executive role. It was a room above a neighborhood bookstore in Oak Park. Nora had dragged me there on a wet November evening under the lie of, "Just come listen." It was a small gathering of women and men over 50 from different industries, tech, healthcare, manufacturing, media, talking about invisible off-ramps, stalled promotions, strange language in performance reviews, succession plans that suddenly looked like youth campaigns with expense accounts. There were 17 folding chairs, stale cookies, 1 hissing radiator, and more intelligence in that room than I had seen in half the leadership summits of my career. I ended up speaking for 40 minutes. Not in a keynote voice. In my voice. Specific. Dry. Controlled until I wasn't. Afterward, a man named Hector who had spent 28 years in telecom said, "You know you're not done, right? You accidentally started a field manual." I told him that sounded exhausting. He said, "That doesn't make it less true." 3 months later, with Nora's help and Denise's terrifyingly efficient edits, I started a small advisory practice focused on age bias risk in restructuring and succession planning. I know. If you had told me at 40 that I would eventually monetize the autopsy, I would have asked you to leave my kitchen. But life gets very creative once institutions stop pretending to deserve your loyalty. I called it 5th Decade Advisory because subtlety had abandoned me by then. In the first 6 months, I took on 9 clients, for mid-market companies, 2 nonprofit systems, 1 hospital network, and 2 law firms that wanted help identifying age-coded language in internal documentation. I worked 3 days a week at first, because more than that made me feel like I was volunteering to rebuild the prison. I kept my dining table, bought a proper desk only after invoice number 11, and learned that I liked advising leaders who were at least honest enough to admit they needed an adult in the room. Eli designed my website. Badly at first, then less badly. Ted, in one of the stranger turns of middle age, helped me negotiate office insurance, because apparently divorce does not prevent occasional practical usefulness. Nora joined as a part-time strategic partner after finally deciding compliance was too small a battlefield. Raj never worked with me, but he sent 3 referrals with the subject line, "She counts better than your lawyers." Denise spoke at my first client roundtable and opened with, "I'm here because organizations prefer preventable embarrassment to principled behavior, and I've chosen to work with reality." I nearly framed that. As for Lila, she emailed me 8 months after the article. The message was short. No self-absolution. No TED Talk on growth through discomfort. She said she had left Halbrecht, taken a lower title at a private firm, and spent a lot of time thinking about the difference between advancement and extraction. She also said she had testified fully in a private employment matter brought by another former employee. Then she wrote one line I respected enough to remember. I was rewarded for ignoring what was happening until I became vulnerable to the same machinery. I wrote back 2 sentences. I'm glad you told the truth. I hope next time you tell it sooner. That was all. A year after the article, Halbrecht was still standing. That matters. Not every story ends in rubble. Sometimes the company survives, the logo stays polished, the annual report still arrives on heavy paper, and the people at the top learn just enough shame to become more expensive and slightly less stupid. Sometimes justice is not collapse. Sometimes it is forcing a system to document its own rot in public and pay for the cleanup in money, reputation, and control. The last figure I saw tied to the fallout put total direct costs, outside counsel, PR, turnover, consulting, client loss exposure, internal remediation, at just over $31 million. That number pleased me more than it should have. Not because I wanted random employees to suffer. I didn't. I still don't. But because somewhere in a room full of people who had once used the phrase fresh energy with a straight face, someone had to explain why sidelining a 53-year-old sales director with record numbers turned into a multi-quarter governance crisis. And I would have paid admission to hear that sentence attempted. These days, I work from a second-floor office with uneven wood floors and a coffee machine that makes alarming noises, but excellent espresso. I walk to work when the weather cooperates. I take lunch seriously. I speak to companies that actually want to hear where their language starts going rotten. I still get emails from strangers, mostly people over 45, often over 50, who say some version of, "I thought it was just me." It usually isn't. And that, more than the articles or the board review or Colin's careful disappearance, is the part one carry with me. When Colin told me, "We need fresh energy in leadership," he thought he was saying something modern, strategic, unassailable. What he was really doing was translating prejudice into boardroom dialect and betting that nobody would bother to decode it. He was counting on exhaustion, isolation, professional shame. He was counting on people like me to absorb the insult privately and leave gracefully enough to protect everyone else's calendar. He was wrong. Not because I was fearless. I wasn't. Not because I had some master plan. I didn't. Because I counted. Because I documented. Because I listened when other people whispered what had happened to them. Because once I saw the pattern clearly, I stopped trying to win back dignity from the people who had already priced it into a restructuring memo. So if you're watching this and somebody at your job has suddenly started describing you as stable, seasoned, legacy, institutional, or not quite aligned with the next chapter, don't waste too much time arguing with the adjectives. Start tracking the nouns. Names, dates, titles, salaries, replacements, meeting invites that vanish, promises that move, patterns that repeat. Count. And if this story hit somewhere uncomfortably close to home, tell me in the comments what phrase they used on you, because I promise you it's never as original as they think it is. Subscribe if you want more stories about what really happens behind the glass walls, and if you know someone who's being gently managed toward irrelevance while still carrying the whole floor on their back, send this to them. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a room full of polished liars is remember exactly what they said.